Do we even know the real deadline for avoiding a no-deal Brexit? The UK's highest court to decide whether the Prime Minister had the right to order Parliament's longest suspension since 1945, smack in the run-up to the deadline for leaving the European Union. What happens if the judges rule against Downing Street? What about the new deadline that's now emerging from across the Channel? Finland and France's leaders telling Boris Johnson he's got till the end of this month to put in writing concrete suggestions that would prevent Britain from crashing out of the EU on October 31st without a deal. Johnson last month promised as much to Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel. But does he even want a deal? His chief strategist has been quoted as dismissing the PM's pledge as a sham. Now, with no deal Brexit looming large, those in the front line seem more open to compromise. Late Wednesday, the leader of Northern Ireland's unionist DUP party traveled to Dublin with the prospect of a return of a hard border, endangering that 1992 Good Friday Agreement that ended sectarian conflict in the north. Arlene Foster insists hers is not the party of no deal. Could an 11th hour compromise still be possible? Under what form? Today in the France 24 debate, who to stop a no-deal Brexit? Joining us from London, Andrew Lillico, Executive Director of Europe Economics. Welcome back to the show.
Hello there, Ian.
From Dublin, we welcome Mary Daly, Professor of History at the University College Dublin. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Adrian Rod, Professor at the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po and its Saint-Germain-en-Laye campus.
Good evening.
And Robert Frank, who teaches at the University of Paris 1 at Sorbonne University, the author of To Be or Not to Be European, The British and Europe from the 17th Century to Brexit.
Good evening.
Thanks for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's begin with the latest. It's in London, third and final day of arguments before the Supreme Court. A lawyer for former British Prime Minister John Major asserting that Boris Johnson's reasons for suspending parliaments in the final weeks for Brexit, quote, cannot be true. A decision, says the attorney, motivated by, quote, Johnson's political interest in ensuring that there was no activity in Parliament ahead of a crucial EU summit on October 17th and 18th. You agree with that assessment, Adrian Ron?
Well, the point indeed that John Major has made through his lawyer is that there doesn't seem to be any valid reason for such a long prorogation, that the government has not supplied any credible reason and any justifiable reason, and therefore that the real reason for that long prorogation must be something that is not valid and therefore implicitly not lawful. And it is true that the government hasn't explicitly given a clear indication as to why such a long prorogation would be needed.
Andrew Lillico, the lawyers for John Major, expressing frustration that the government didn't answer their claims. What happens if the judges next week rule in favor of those who want to order Parliament back to work?
Well, I think it should be irrelevant because the government's position, quite rightly, is that this isn't a matter for the courts. They don't have any jurisdiction here. The traditional position is quite likely that, and this was the position taken by the junior English courts, was that they don't have any jurisdiction over these kinds of matters. It's not a legal question. If you disapprove of a decision of the monarch, then your recourse is to complain to the monarch. And if you don't like that, then call for a replacement monarch or get rid of the monarchy altogether. It's just not a legal question. The monarch has, it's clear that there's an ability to prorogue, and they prorogued for a relatively modest length of time, well within the norms
longest since 1945.
For many decades. I mean, John Major himself John Major himself prorogued Parliament, and the effect of that was that Parliament shut down for a period of 41 days in 1997. So it was a lot longer period that he had then. It's not a particularly abnormal thing. The Parliament is prorogued almost every year. What happened was that part of the reason why it's been prorogued for a little while here is that we had the longest sitting Parliament since the Civil War. It was well overdue, a prorogation. And the reality is, for all of the claims that this somehow interferes with Parliament's ability to stop no deal. Parliament has stopped no deal. They passed the legislation that they wanted, so the whole thing's ludicrous. So they don't have any right to have a jurisdiction over this matter. The contention that it's improper to have a political purpose of prorogation is absurd. All prorogation, having a Queen's speech, is a political matter. So the government's position is quite correctly that this whole business of saying, well, you must have had some political reason for prorogation. All prorogation is political. Of course it is. So who cares what they say about that? They don't. And so I think that if they were to rule against them, then the government ought to say, well, we told you it was none of your business. It's none of your business. So we're not going to do anything about it. Now, the government itself has proposed various forms of relief.
Opposite views on that one. One question for you, Mary Daly. It's unclear to us. Has Parliament, in fact, I know they voted that measure that overrode the government's position, but have they stopped no deal, as Andrew Lillico just said?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say. I think in Ireland we still regard no deal as a distinct probability, maybe the most probable outcome. This may change, but I think it's very difficult to see alternatives, and some way could be found to achieve no deal, though unless some kind of solution emerges.
Unless some kind of solution emerges?
And I think the kind of solution that, the Irish opinion at the moment is really between either there will be a no deal, maybe not on the 31st, maybe a bit later, or there will be some kind of a settlement which will probably involve revisiting the original version of the backstop, which applied only to Northern Ireland, and working out some kind of a settlement that would, in effect, keep Northern Ireland within the single market and the customs union, and have some form of boundaries on the Irish Sea. That was the original backstop. It was objected to by the DUP and abandoned accordingly. I think one thing that could be dealt with would be a statement in the political declaration to the effect that nothing that happens within this backstop in any way questions or threatens Northern Ireland's constitutional existence as part of the United Kingdom.
Let's revisit.
Because that's really the
Let's revisit that point, because I want to go more into that, and maybe a little bit later on in our discussion. I just want to ask about the mood right now in the UK. Trust seems in short supply these days. You've heard both sides of the argument when it comes to proroguing Parliament. Now we've got political conference season underway, and with the prospect of that general election at some point soon. Here we had on Wednesday the Prime Minister. He went, looked like a campaign stop to a university hospital in the London area, where he was once again haunted by people recalling that red Brexit bus promising 350 million euros a week in EU funds for the National Health Service.
This is a ward primarily.
Not enough people on this ward. There are not enough doctors. There are not enough nurses.
Right.
The NHS has been destroyed.
Right. Well,
It's been destroyed. It's been destroyed. And now you come here for a press opportunity.
well, actually, there's no press here.
What do you mean there's no press here? Who are these people?
Sir, we need to stop raising the voice now.
We're here to actually find out what we can do to further this whole.
Well, that's not going to fix things now. It's a bit late, isn't it?
So we see, Robert Frank, they're somebody in the hospital. Those images have gone viral, taking Boris Johnson to task. The level of division right now in the UK, is this unprecedented?
I think you have to come back to Cromwell, the 17th century. Of course, it was worse then. It was a civil war, and we are very far, fortunately, of a civil war. But a division like that in the United Kingdom, it's you never see that.
How do you explain it? Because seen from here, for us here in France, Britain is this island of temperance and moderation.
Temperance, moderation, but it's not quite the case with Boris Johnson. I wouldn't say that you can qualify Boris Johnson with temperance and moderacy. It's the rise of populism that we see everywhere in Europe and the United States, and that changes the mood, changes the ambiance, the atmosphere in political. And maybe you have something else. I think Brexit, it's not only a question of economy. It's not only a question of customs, of union. It's also a question of identity. And the Remainers feel themselves very European. And that's a scoop. That's something new. You never had in Europe a big demonstration like in London a few weeks ago with so many blue flags, so many flags of Europe. So that is the paradox. It's in the country which is supposed to be the most Eurosceptical that you had the biggest demonstration in favor of Europe. That means that when your European identity is threatened, then you react. Then this identity comes back. And on the other side, of course, you have another identity which is quite anti-European, and you never had a clash of identities. And if you have to add that, the Scottish identity, the Northern Irish identity, the Welsh one, that means that all these identities have.
So we're in the middle of this unprecedented crisis. It's testing constitutional limits, say many, and yet the UK sticking to its tradition, big long summer break for Parliament, Boris Johnson proroguing the big parties holding their conferences this September as they would normally this time of the year. Your thoughts on these? On one hand, this giant deadline looming, and then everybody going about their business.
Sort of discrepancy between what's happening really and what's happening in the party. I think it's maybe a little changing. We saw that in the DUP, changing its wording, even if it's not going very, very far. Changes also in the Labour Party, which is a little more united than it was a few weeks ago. Maybe it won't work, but I think it's changing because the deadline. Because the deadline is coming. But because of this huge political and constitutional crisis, that means that we will have many events coming, unpredictable, and we don't know if general elections will give a solution. We don't know if, anyway, there will not be a necessity for a second referendum on Europe.
These are going to be strange party conferences we see, both for Conservatives and Labour, because the leadership have to deal with a lot of dissent internally.
Yes.
What kind of a general election campaign, picking up on Robert Frank's point, can we expect?
Well, I think party conferences are going to be an opportunity for the different political parties to take clear positions, or at least that's what they hope to do with the support.
Yeah, because usually these are
party base.
scripted affairs, aren't they? Where, you go and everybody rallies behind whoever the leader is, right?
Yes, and there are a few dissenting voices, but that don't trouble.
This time, do you
much.
expect surprises, Adrian Rudd?
Well, I think that the Liberal Democrats are already clearly set on what their position is going to be. They've been consistent for a long time, so not much is going to change there. They're positioning themselves really as the party for Remain, and they're hoping for a referendum, or if they go into a general election, they say vote for us and we'll actually cancel Brexit. The Tory party, we've already seen Boris Johnson try to realign, try to shift the position of the Conservative Party more to the right, remove internal dissension by seizing that opportunity to actually expel some of the more moderate pro-European members from the party, having them deselected so that they can't stand as Conservative candidates in the next election. Johnson is trying to make the Conservative Party more appealing to voters on the right, to strongly Eurosceptic voters, as we may see a realignment of that party there, away from the more liberal values that David Cameron, for instance, represented. And then the Labour Party remains torn, as it has been for a long time, between its more centrist social democratic positions and the harder left that Jeremy Corbyn represents. We're not going to see a change of leader, but we're going to see Corbyn continue to be challenged inside his own party.
Now, Andrew Lillico, these party conferences, are they just going to be scripted affairs as always, or could we see theatrics? And in particular, should Tory Remainers be welcome at the Conservative Party conference?
Well, I think there's a few things to say. So I didn't really agree with some of the points that were just made there. Within the Conservative Party, a number of the rebels who were expelled were well to the right politically of Boris Johnson. The question of whether you're in favour or against leaving the EU cuts across traditional questions of left and right in the UK. So it isn't the case that the people who are wanting to leave the EU are more to the right and the ones who are wanting to remain are more in the centre. It's not nearly as simple as that. Many of the people, as I say, who are wanting to remain are well to the right of people like Boris Johnson. The reality is going to be, I think, that the Liberals are going to be fairly united, Labour Party enormously split, and the Conservatives in the process of a purge. So the Conservatives, and I think that you should understand some of the things going on over the past few weeks in the following way. I think that the Conservatives have had two key kinds of goals. They've wanted to create a situation where there had to be a general election, and they've wanted to boost the Liberal Democrat vote in that general election. When there was the general election in 2017, there was a big spike up in the Labour Party's opinion poll rating and then ultimately their vote over the period of the campaign. Now, at the moment, Boris Johnson is well ahead, and if you add in, it's likely to be a pact with the Brexit Party. So as things stand, it would be very likely a general election would result in a no-deal alliance winning a very comfortable majority. And what the Boris tacticians want to make sure is that that isn't changed by the Labour Party spiking over the period of the election. So they have been trying to make sure that the Lib Dem vote is shored up. They've given them lots of new, reasonably credible MPs, so they expelled a number of their own party MPs, and they persuaded them, induced them to join the Liberal Democrats. They've given the Liberal Democrats quite a clear position in terms of tempting them into revoking altogether, and so it's all about positioning for a general election.
All about positioning.
What will happen is that there will be
Andrew,
an
I'm going to have to
extension
interrupt
of
you
our
very
membership,
briefly.
and the EU will say you have to have a
I'm going to
vote.
have to interrupt you very briefly because we have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
On July 23, 2018, the Etapa Dam in Laos collapsed.
That dam up there was a curse. There's death, poverty, hunger all around us.
My rice paddy, my money, everything was taken away.
No one is allowed to talk about the tragedy. The government continues its relentless sale of Laos' natural resources.
No one dares to speak.
There'll be nothing to grow and nothing left to fish in the rivers for the next generations. Instead, there'll be only foreign investors.
Watch our investigation into a tragedy foretold.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen, on France 24 and France24.com.
Sur France 24, la nuit, on est très fiers d'accompagner les Amériques dans leurs soirées, de voir l'Asie se réveiller, et on est là jusqu'à ce que Paris s'éveille.
France 24 es más que solo noticias. Es libertad, igualdad y actualidad. Nosotros damos un paso más allá, con información al momento para analizar, comprender, poner en perspectiva y debatir.
In Live from Paris, our correspondents around the world keep you up to date.
من الطبيعي أن يكون شعارها الحرية، وخاصة حرية التعبير في بلد حرية التعبير.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Africa News. Your eyes on Africa. Bringing you the latest from across the continent.
Eye on Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. The death of Tunisia's former longtime strongman, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, had been in exile in Saudi Arabia since his ouster in 2011 during the Arab Spring. He'd been suffering from cancer. He was 83. Washington wants a peaceful solution, says Mike Pompeo, after weekend attacks on Saudi oil facilities. The U.S. Secretary of State continuing his tour of the Gulf in the UAE. He responded to remarks by his Iranian counterpart that any military strike on Iran could cause, quote, all-out war. Israel's elections. The vote count nearly done. Likud's Benjamin Netanyahu offers a unity government, but as blue and white leader Benny Gantz consolidates a slender two-seat advantage, the centrist leader insisting on the top spot in any deal. Canada's Prime Minister to address the press again after calling candidates for the upcoming general election as more past images of Justin Trudeau in brownface emerge. His conservative rival in next month's general election, Andrew Scheer, expresses disappointment, and shock. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering, when is the deadline for a no-deal Brexit really, and who's going to stop it? We're talking about it with Andrew Lillico, Executive Director of Europe Economics, who joins us from London. In Dublin, Mary Daly, Professor of History at University College Dublin. We'll welcome back as well to Adrian Rod, Professor at the Saint-Germain-en-Laye campus of the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. And Robert Franck, who teaches at Sorbonne University, Paris 1, the author of To Be or Not to Be European, The British and Europe from the 17th Century to Brexit. In French, is it also translated in English?
No, not yet.
Not yet, okay. A word to publishers watching out there. We're talking about when the deadline is because here in Paris on Wednesday, there was the visit of the Finnish Prime Minister. Finland currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Council. Antti Rinne, welcomed by Emmanuel Macron, and warning that Boris Johnson has until the end of this month, 11 days from now, to put proposals in writing, quote, then it's over. At the same time, over in Strasbourg, the outgoing EU Commission President briefing the European Parliament.
The risk of a no-deal Brexit remains very real. Until those proposals have been presented, I will not be able to tell you, looking you straight in the eye, that any real progress has been achieved.
So, when is the deadline, Adrian Rod? When's the deadline? Is the deadline October 31st? Is the deadline before the European Council summit? Is the deadline, as the leaders of Finland and France say, at the end of this month?
Well, the legal deadline, as inscribed into British law currently, is, of course, the end of October. The EU Council, mid-October, just after mid-October, is when a deal would have to be agreed at the European level at the latest so that it can then be approved by the British Parliament very quickly in the days to follow. What we've just heard from the Finnish and French leaders, Finland hoping to speak for the European Union, as you said, now with the rotating presidency, is that they haven't had any concrete proposals from Britain yet. And if they don't have any by the end of this month, there will quite simply be no time to study them seriously before the EU Council, and that therefore any further talks would basically be pointless.
All right, back at the start of the month, the Daily Telegraph quoted sources at Downing Street who said the Prime Minister's chief strategist, Dominic Cummings, had dismissed negotiations with the EU as a sham. Now, those were from Andrew Lillico, based on remarks that Lillico is said to have made in meetings back in July. Are those still relevant, or can we expect concrete proposals in writing before the end of the month?
Well, I think you mean that Cummings made back in July, rather than myself.
Dominic Cummings.
But I think that the British, what the British are after is quite clear. I think that the envoy Frost has the British envoy has set things out quite clearly. We want to remove the backstop and replace it with the alternative arrangements, including possibly a common health and animal and plant health and welfare regime with a Stormont lock, and then to remove the level playing field conditions and commit to a Canada-type free trade agreement. So it's pretty clear that that's what they're after. The idea that it's the talk of it being a sham, I think that the suspicion in the UK has been that the things that the EU has often said on these things are by and large a sham, that they've by and large, when they say, oh, there absolutely can't be any sort of deal unless we continue with the backstop, I think it's generally assumed that that's bluff. And I think the idea, I think it's the realistic deadline is actually October the 17th and 18th for a deal, because if the EU doesn't agree to a deal, I think that's their last chance to get a deal, because what will happen then is the UK will seek an extension, probably be Prime Minister Corbyn that seeks the extension, because Boris Johnson will resign rather than doing it. There will be a general election because the Parliament won't feel it has the authority to do anything else other than have a general election. That general election will return a party, an alliance committed to having no deal, no negotiations, and no notice. So they will just instantly go out. They won't even wait, I don't think, until the 31st of January. They'll just go out immediately upon winning, and that's it. So, and I think that the recognition of that is actually part of the reason why we've seen some attempt to consider moving a little bit in recent days. I don't think the EU will decide in the end that it wants to move, because I think that.
So wait, hang on a second. You're suggesting,
Andrew,
you're suggesting that that the EU is starting to bend, is what you're suggesting, because we've heard time and again in the last few days, especially from the French president, that people have had enough on this side of the channel.
I think people have had enough. I think that the most likely thing is that they've decided that the EU has decided it's had enough of us, quite rightly, and that we'll end up with no deal. But I think there has been some repositioning of the possibility of saying, well, maybe if the Irish could be talked around to it, we could do without something to do with the backstop. There's been a little bit of talk of that. I think that that's a bit of an attempt to position themselves just in case they wanted to do that at some point. Because the reality, the no deal which they would rather have is a no deal involving this Parliament. Because if they no deal with this Parliament may panic and then do something like pass May's deal. If they end up with no deal with a new Parliament where they've been elected on a no deal platform, which is probably what will happen if there's a general election, then there's no question of them doing anything panicking thereafter. That's the end. So I think it's an awkward position that the EU finds itself in, and it's facing up to the reality that there's quite a high probability that they will end up with a scenario that they don't want, which is a no deal with the British government that's committed to no deal. And so I think there's all kinds of things you can say about how we've got here, but I think that they are considering moving if they need to.
Robert Frank?
I think you have to get out the United Kingdom and see what's happening here on this side of the channel. The Europeans are fed up with all that. They're fed up. So why an extension? And if an extension there has to be, it has to be voted at the unanimity of the 27. The unanimity. That's not sure. It's not sure you have an unanimity. That's maybe good for Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson could say, Parliament wants me to go to Brussels, I go to Brussels. I ask an extension, it's refused. So you see, it's their fault. I think, it won't happen. But I think the European Union is able to risk that. And one other thing, if there is general election.
So you're saying that UK has a weaker bargaining hand than the UK,
of course,
than the EU?
Of course. And the United Kingdom is not realizing one thing. It's 27 against 1. The dealers of Brexit think that they're still in the EU and that the EU is defending the interest of the 28. No, the EU is defending the interest of the 27, Republic of Ireland included.
All right, let's talk about that.
Against United Kingdom. United Kingdom is not out, not yet, but it's just as if it was out. And what I want to say is that if the elections comes only in November, it's not sure that Boris Johnson would win them. Of course, now he is in a very, very good position in the polls. But if there's a no deal the 31st of October, and if the elections come in November, be sure that the United Europe will not be generous with the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
it will be a hard Brexit, just to make sure that the public opinion in the United Kingdom understands that hard Brexit means hard Brexit.
All right, and 27 countries, the one that's in the front line is Ireland, of course, the one that shares a land border with the UK. On Wednesday, the leader of the Northern Irish DUP party was in Dublin. Arlene Foster, whose formation props up the government of Boris Johnson at Westminster, met with the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, for 45 minutes. Afterwards, in a statement, they said they had agreed to stay in touch. Foster, who's blowing hot and cold now, it seems, over a compromise.
There is a lot of commentary about the DUP being no-deal Brexiteers, but I think if people look at the evidence, they will find something very different. But what we want to see is a sensible deal that works for us in Northern Ireland, of course, one that works for our colleagues and our neighbours down here in the Republic of Ireland as well, but one that works for the UK constitutional position as well. That's very important, and one I hope that the European Union will respect.
Mary Daly, what do you make from Arlene Foster's remarks?
Well, it's very hard to say. First of all, I don't really think she controls the DUP. I think the people who will make that decision are actually Jeffrey Donaldson and Nigel Dodds and perhaps Sammy Wilson. So I think we have to start with that. Secondly, I think the DUP don't actually hold the balance of political power anymore in Westminster because since all those Tories lost the whip. So to some extent, they're in a less powerful position than they were, we'd say, two months ago. But the position is very tricky. I think they may want a deal. If you look at Northern Ireland, you'd find the Ulster Farmers Union, which is very much a unionist-controlled group, though it will have mixed membership, is very concerned about a no deal. The business communities in Northern Ireland, again, respective of politics, are very concerned about Brexit and a no deal. If it came to a referendum, if it came to the Union or the EU, there's no doubt some of them, a lot of those would still stick with the Union. But opinion in Northern Ireland is not, the vote was 58-42 in favour of Remain, and I would have thought that the business community in particular and the younger people who are, I suppose, in the workforce, the Remain majority is higher. So Arlene has to bear that in mind. It's quite interesting the way that the DUP has managed to withstand those kind of business pressures up to now.
Up to now, you say, but up to now, Mary Daly, and now there's this sort of sense that maybe something's afoot, because let's just remind our viewers here, it was either you have a border in the Irish Sea, which the Unionists are dead set against, or you have a customs union with the Republic of Ireland. Is there some kind of compromise that is possible?
Well, very hard to say. First of all, even under the EU, there was always a separate phytosanitary regime in play on the island of Ireland that was different to Britain. So, and there are customs checks carried out as of today in places like Larne on livestock coming in. So there has been a consciousness for a long time of an all-island sanitary regime, and that existed even in diluted forms for many, many years. So in one sense you have that. I think basically it's back to something somebody said at the beginning. This is not just about economics. It's very, very emotional and it's very, very political. And I think if the DUP, if Northern Ireland, and bear in mind, Arlene Foster is not First Minister. There's none. The Assembly is in disarray for over 2 years. The DUP actually didn't have a majority. The Unionists didn't have a majority in that Assembly if it had ever met, and their electoral position is under PR vote is kind of wobbly. I mean, it's still strong, but it's they cannot claim majority authority in Northern Ireland. So there is a need to try and come to some settlement, but it has to be a settlement that can be presented as not in any way diluting the union.
Is that possible?
So if some wording, as I said, I think something like adding to the political declaration, and the EU is very clear, the political declaration can be amended in various ways. They've said this many times, and I don't see why you couldn't have something affirming that all 27 member countries of the EU recognise that Northern Ireland remains an integral part of the United Kingdom. I mean, Boris Johnson was talking about setting up customs zones, customs-free ports in Britain, and he was going to one in Hull, I can't remember, he was scattering them around the place. And in one sense, what you would be doing with Northern Ireland was giving it something like similar status, except for a larger geographical area. I mean, the EU can buy it because they're very small economically. The problems arise that the Scots Scottish nationalists would be screaming for something similar tomorrow. It would give Northern Ireland cake and eat it in truth. And I personally think that that would be very welcome. It's a fragile economy, it's a fragile society. I think it's something that could give it a real boost that might be transformative, not so much in its identities, but just in terms of the optimism and the wellness of the society.
Andrew Lillico, you agree?
There's only about 5% support amongst unionists for the backstop, so about 75% of them are opposed. 20% of them say it's a bad arrangement, but they fear that if we don't have something like that, then you end up with a United Ireland vote. So the unionist community is very clear that it's very, very opposed, overwhelmingly so to this. And the reality of the Good Friday Agreement is that it guarantees that the Northern Ireland will remain a sovereign part of the United Kingdom unless and until the people of Northern Ireland decide that they're going to leave. Whereas the backstop deems by treaty the United Kingdom no longer to be sovereign over the key economic laws affecting Northern Ireland. So it's just a quite straightforward violation of the Good Friday Agreement, and the UK cannot agree to it. And it's not. And it's. I want you. An important thing to understand is this isn't just a matter of DUP being objecting. There's enormous objections right across the House of Commons to this. We see a lot of objection within the Conservative Party in particular, but actually there are quite a lot of Labour MPs that object to that as well. And so I think that it's just a complete non-starter. The reality is that any kind of arrangement here which works as a backstop has to respect the principle that Northern Ireland's laws get to be set by the United Kingdom. Now, the UK proposed, it itself proposed in 2017 that there was a common animal and health welfare regime for the island of Ireland. It proposed that there would be a common single Europe energy market, that it was prepared to be flexible on transport rules, and it wanted to have common customs procedures. So the UK has proposed these things before, and Boris Johnson is by and large just repeating the things which was the UK government's proposals in 2017. So I actually think that there's much less to this discussion than it's often made. But unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be any way forward on this from the EU side. They don't seem to want to respect the principle that Northern Ireland must remain part of the United Kingdom.
All right, let me ask Mary Daly about this. Let me ask Mary Daly to respond to this. Let me ask Mary Daly, do you agree, and do you agree with what Andrew Lillico just said, that actually the backstop agreement violates the Good Friday Accords that ended those decades of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland?
That has been alleged. It has not been seriously tested, is the way I would put it. We don't. What we have is some opinion polling. We don't have robust evidence. I've seen the argument. As I've said, I haven't seen it legally tested. I think you could, again, write some rubric that would finesse that. What you cannot obviously have is the Assembly installment, which hasn't met for over 2.5 years, but you cannot have that having a say over EU trade policy. I mean, that opens such a massive issue EU-wide that it cannot.
Let me ask Andrew Lillico something that Mary said earlier, that now that Boris Johnson has fewer MPs on his side of the aisle, effectively the power of the DUP to influence the current government has gone away. Well, basically, Northern Ireland matters less to the conversation taking place at Westminster?
No, I don't think it's, and I don't think that's what Professor Kenny was saying. I think her point was absolutely correct, which is that the DUP is no longer required in order for the Conservative Party to have a majority, because the Conservative Party doesn't have a majority even with them. So she's absolutely correct on that. And I actually think that people have enormously exaggerated the significance of the DUP's agreement with the Conservative Party within this. There were a large number of Conservative MPs who, regardless of what the DUP DUP said would have been opposed to the idea of the backstop anyway. Now, some Conservative MPs have used the DUP as their excuse. So they've said the DUP says that they're opposed, so we're not going to go against them. And it might be that if the DUP decided that it was going to sell out the unionist community in Northern Ireland, that would make a difference to some of those Conservative MPs. I don't think it would make enough difference, but it would probably shift some. I think the chances of that are approximately nil. But the more fundamental point is that it's not only the DUP. This point that Northern Ireland is that the British take very seriously the Good Friday Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement guarantees that they will not give up the sovereignty of Northern Ireland without the people of Northern Ireland explicitly declaring that that's what they want to happen. And so it's just impossible for the Parliament to agree to this.
All right, before we go,
can I come in there? Can I come in for a moment?
Very briefly,
there,
Mary
just simply to say, just briefly, I think there are long passages in history where Northern Ireland was largely forgotten by Westminster, and my sense is that if Boris Johnson was convinced, and if an agreement was reached, which involved to some extent some compromises on Northern Ireland that fell short, that retained the principle of its being part of the United Kingdom, I actually think that many people in Britain, particularly in England, would sign up to it tomorrow. There were various polls where people said they would be happy to. There was a poll which said that people would ditch Northern Ireland tomorrow if that was the price of Brexit. So I think be careful on that.
All right. Brexit began with a promise by the then Prime Minister David Cameron. Re-elect me, and I'll give you a referendum. He's been doing the rounds this week, his book being released this Thursday. And if the current crisis is testing the UK's constitutional limits, Cameron reveals he's done once before, suggesting that back in September of 2014, the Scotland referendum seemed like it was touch and go, and that he asked the Queen to, quote, raise an eyebrow. Then, when a parishioner coming out of church outside her Balmoral residence in Scotland quipped that he wouldn't be asking Her Majesty about the referendum there, she replied she hoped, quote, people will think very carefully about the future. I'm turning to the historian here, Robert Frank, because the Queen has been a monarch since the 1950s, never involved in politics. This one instance, and there were denials at the time by the palace that it was in any way trying to influence the vote. And David Cameron seems to be saying the opposite now. We've been talking about whether or not the Queen gets involved in this fight. Your reaction to what Cameron is saying?
Well, he asked her only to raise an eyebrow. It's not much. And what she said...
Hang on, raise an eyebrow? Is it too much to ask the Queen to raise an eyebrow? If the Scotland referendum, which they wound up staying by 10 points, but if it had been close, would that raised eyebrow have made a difference?
It could have done. The Prime Minister is not supposed to ask the monarch to take a political position whatsoever, and that's what he was doing. He was asking her to take a political position. I think if the remark that she made that day was as a result of the request that David Cameron made to her, I think she handled it quite well, because she wasn't overtly calling for people to vote in favour of Scotland.
But we remember that there was a whole media storm at the time saying, is she getting involved? Because it was so unusual.
People interpreted it, of course, as a call.
Cameron was wrong to ask that.
Yeah.
But she was quite good.
Yes, I agree.
in her answer. Now, we could ask another question. If the Brexit is a risk for Scotland coming out of the United Kingdom, is it the duty or not of the Queen to raise an eyebrow? I mean, she doesn't have to, she has not the right to be involved in politics, but she represents the unity of the United Kingdom. So, of course, she could raise an eyebrow if
because
Brexit shows a risk of independence for Scotland. Because
there's been heated arguments the last few weeks over this issue of the prorogation of Parliament that we talked about at the outset, of whether or not the Queen should get involved.
That's why what we'll say the British Supreme Court will be very important and maybe very serious. Of course, if the Supreme Court says the same thing as the Court of England and Wales, no problem for Boris Johnson. But if the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom says the same thing as the Scottish one, that is very serious, because that would mean that Boris Johnson deceived the Queen. And that is a serious case.
The Queen has never gotten involved in politics. In your research, preparing your book, did you ever think, well, she's pro-Europe or she's pro-Brexit? Because I've heard both arguments.
Well, everybody remembers when she came with a blue robe and not really stars, but something yellow on the hat.
I believe it was a visit to Germany at the time.
A blue hat with some... Yeah. So, well, that's just like raising an eyebrow. So she can say, well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. But I'm the Queen of the United Kingdom and not of a disunited kingdom.
Andrew Lilico, what did you project when you saw that dress?
I thought that the Queen was wearing an elegant dress. I think she always wears elegant dresses. I would look. I think one of the interesting things here is that both sides, with respect to the monarch, have both pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit people have at various points in the past few months appealed to the Queen personally to reject the advice that she was given by her Prime Minister, which I think is has an interesting implication, that the political system recognises the notion that the Queen, even though we say, oh, well, she can't reject the advice given by the monarch, the system appears to accept, by stating that they wanted to, the principle that she could, which is a rather interesting thought that one might get a bit more constitutional monarchy in the future than we've been used to over recent decades.
Reform will certainly be on the cards after all this is said and done. Many thanks, Andrew Lilico, for joining us from Londonderry Daily in Dublin. I want to thank Adrian Rod as well as Robert Frank. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.